Kyle is he founded the Education Action Group, and he's written a column. I'm sure he's written more than one, but I have a column here in front of me that Kyle has written about the Common Core standards, and he joins us. Kyle, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing well. Good morning.
Good morning, Tim, here with Ed. Tell us about your organization.
Sure. So Education Action Group, we started about 6.5 years ago by looking at what's going on in schools across the country. And so we look at Common Core. We look at union activity around the country. We look at school spending so taxpayers know where their dollars are going. And we talk about indoctrination in the classroom and other things that our students are learning.
What is, explain for our listeners who have not heard about Common Core what it is.
Sure. So a few years ago, a number of governors got together through their organization, the National Governors Association, as well as state superintendents from around the country, and the ACT and the SAT, which are two companies that provide the tests to assess where students are at in terms of what they've learned and what sort of college they can go to. They all got together and they said we should have one set of standards, essentially national standards, that states will adopt, can quote-unquote voluntarily adopt, so we can get an accurate assessment of how schools are doing, and we can tell how kids in Idaho are doing versus kids in Florida, etc. And so that developed. They claimed that it was state-led. I challenged that point, but they claimed that it was state-led. But then in 2009, it was incentivized so that states would adopt Common Core, and it was incentivized through the stimulus. And so President Obama said, "Hey, let's throw a few $1 billion at states if they will adopt these standards." And to me, that was the moment when this really became kind of a federal project, where the federal government got involved, and they basically said, let's attach some strings and let's throw out some cash and have states adopt these standards. And so that's kind of where we're at today. Now, the reason that we're talking about it so much right now is because states are starting to implement the standards. And there are a variety of things that are connected to the standards. One, probably the best example, is that teachers will be held accountable through standardized testing based on the standards, and that's where I think we're probably seeing the biggest rub today.
Let me ask you this, Kyle. These standards that states were given incentives. Basically, some people call it a bribe. They were offered money if they would, quote unquote, voluntarily accept these nationalized standards. But at the time that these states were doing so, the standards weren't even finished yet, were they?
No, and that's the interesting thing is a lot of these states adopted the standards or verbally consented to adopting the standards before they were even finalized. Probably one of the worst examples is Wisconsin, where there's not even a state board of education. And so one person, the state superintendent, made the decision to adopt the standards literally just a couple days after they were formally released. And so and think back, too, this was 2009, 2010, when the sky was falling for government because, the economy was not good and the tax revenues were not good. And so state governments and local governments were looking for every dollar possible. And so I think states like Wisconsin and others around the country ran to adopt these standards just to have the chance to get this cash. And now some states are waking up to what they did, and they're second guessing that. But other states like Wisconsin, for example, they don't really appear to be doing a whole lot to change course.
Now, is it because some people may say, well, I like the idea of national standards, so we all know that all our kids are learning the same thing. But my understanding is that at least 3 federal laws prohibit the U.S. Department of Education from directing or supervising or controlling any nationalized standards, curriculum, or testing. Is that true?
Well, they are what Arne Duncan has been doing, because he's the education secretary. He's been a huge proponent of Common Core. what he'll do is he'll go out and give these speeches, and he'll set up these straw man arguments. Like he'll say, well, the federal government can never, design and implement and force curriculum on school districts, which is not really what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the standards, and see what the logical process here is that a state will create standards or implement standards. The test to figure out how the students are doing will be aligned to those standards, and then the curriculum will be aligned to the test. That's
Right.
kind of the natural progression, and that's the road that you follow down to figure out, what students are going to be learning. And so I personally have no problem if states want to voluntarily get together and figure out what their standards should be. I personally have no problem with that. That's a state's right. They should be able to do that. But when the federal government steps in and says, we're going to give you cash in order to do it, and oh, by the way, we're going to give you cash to create a database of very sensitive student information, which then can be shared with us, as in the federal government, or be shared with private companies, I think that's where you're seeing something bigger happening. And it's not just this voluntary, group of governors getting together to figure out what's best for their state.
Talking to Kyle Olson, Kyle, who founded Education Action Group. We're talking about something called Common Core, which is going across the country. It's what do you call it? Standards.
Well, there's nationalized standards, but as Kyle points out, that leads to nationalized tests and curriculum.
Kyle, let me ask you this. Is there any chance we'll ever go back to state-controlled education? By state, I don't mean the federal government. I'm talking about the various states having control over their, and not, maybe some would argue, well, they still do. They don't have to submit to all this federal government stuff by taking the money,
Right.
Taking the federal dollars. But, even back to President Bush's No Child Left Behind, I remember at one time President Reagan vowed to shut down the Department of Education in Washington, D.C. because he said that Washington, D.C. had no business dealing with education in the states. I mean, the more local, the better accountability you have. So I guess, but sort of gave up that idea because the national media, the liberal media, if you say you're for closing down the Department of Education, then you're against education itself.
Right.
That's the way it's
Right.
interpreted, and sadly, that's interpreted that way by many in the voting public as well. Can anybody be a Kyle Olson out there and on the national scene that's in a part of the congressional or senatorial leadership that can speak to this issue?
That's a good question. But you're right. I mean, a lot of the rhetoric we hear is if you want to shut down the Department of Education, then clearly you hate children and you hate
Right.
teachers.
It's ridiculous, but that's the way it's framed,
Right, right. But, yeah, I mean, to me, we need to be seeing states taking that control back. I mean, they have just voluntarily been ceding control to the federal government for years. And it was, like you said, one step was No Child Left Behind. The latest step has been the Race to the Top program that the Obama administration created. Common Core was a part of that. And so what we've been seeing is this power shift to Washington, D.C., because you've got this, I think, very kind of controlist attitude in Washington that they know how to run our lives better. They know how to run schools better. They know how to run school lunches better.
But do the states submit to this because they want the federal dollars?
Yeah, to me, that's ultimately what it came down to.
Okay, then that's their fault.
Well,
right?
Yeah, exactly. It is their fault, and they need to take it back. There's a variety of ways that we can fix education.
Yeah.
My language there is very clear. I'm not saying fix public education or fix the system, but I think we really need to transcend the existing system, and there are a variety of ways to do that. Because we, on our site, we're talking constantly about the problems, whether it's inappropriate relationships between teachers and students, or people stealing money, or just dropout factories like we see in Milwaukee, for example, or across the country. And we need to be looking at, okay, how do we cut ties with this existing system and transcend it? And so that should be the direction that we're heading in terms of our discussions, public policy discussions, and those sorts of things.
We're talking to Kyle Olson, who's the founder of the Education Action Group. Their website is eagnews.org. Check them out for the latest in the education field. So let me ask you this: if you wanted to list the top 1, 2, or 3 things wrong with Common Core, because what's odd is that all this happened around 2009, 2010, as you've explained, but a lot of people are just now starting to hear about it. So we're getting calls from people. What is this Common Core I'm hearing about now? This is 4 years, 5 years down the road. So if you're speaking to our listeners, those who are watching online, tell them the 1, 2, or 3 top things that you think are wrong with Common Core.
Well, the biggest thing to me is, well, one, you have to look at it as an entire initiative, because what the proponents of Common Core will do, Jeb Bush and others, is they'll want to just focus on the standards. But you have to look at it as an entire package. And when I say that, the worst thing about it is the amount of data collection that will be going on with students. Because, as a parent, I want to know how my child is doing in school, how they're reading, how they're computing math, how they're writing, all of those sorts of things, and collecting data on them on that is one way to do that. But through Common Core, through the databases that were funded by the federal government and created at the state level, they're going well beyond that, and they're collecting information on bus stop times. They're collecting information on a parent's voting status, religious affiliation, what the student is doing on the weekend, how much they're working on the weekend, all sorts of very personal information that then can be shared with the federal government, can be shared with private companies, and those sorts of things. That is one of the manifestations of this Common Core initiative.
All right, Kyle, let me stop you there, and let me just kind of unpack this, have you unpack this a little bit more closely. This kind of information that you just named, that kind of, I would be very concerned as a parent that anybody was collecting that. Is that being done already by states? And then does Common Core ask for that information, or is this being collected via Common Core?
Well, I'll just take my child's school as an example. We as parents, we provide information to the school. We typically write it down on a form in terms of, are there health issues, what's your child's blood type, that sort of thing. So if there's an emergency,
right,
first responders, are able to deal with that information. There's a big difference between having that information sitting in a file folder in my child's school versus having somebody type it into a database and who knows where it's going. And we have seen around the country breaches in security. I mean, just think of the Obamacare website, okay?
Right.
That sort of incompetence is being applied in our schools, because we have seen where there have been data breaches of this sort of information, Social Security numbers, all of that, on very young children being stolen, being hacked. There have been actually some schools that have mistakenly posted that information on their website and for all the public to see. And so to me, it's just a good example of people who may think they're doing something right. They may think that they are doing something good. But ultimately, they shouldn't have that information. They don't deserve to have that information. They haven't earned the right to have the ability to have that sort of information.
We're just about out of time, Kyle. Where can people find out more information about Common Core and your analysis?
Sure. So we have our website is eagnews.org, and if you go to our site, we have a Common Core Watch page where we have a lot of writing, commentary, those sorts of things about Common Core.
Yeah, let me just say this. I know there are people listening. When I said, the state government needs to be in control of education instead of the federal government intervening, I know there's some people saying to me, Tim, the state government doesn't even need to be in charge,
Right.
over it. I understand that, but I'm talking about I'm talking about reality as it exists.
Yeah.
Is that the fact is government does control the public